Okay, there we go. So this is week 3, so we're gonna just get right into it. Welcome. And Zalima, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you. I know we're not outside, but it's still a rainy evening. And so if all of you are from New York City, you hear it outside. I just want to reiterate what Kiana Dunn just stated. Center for Law and Social Justice has been primarily focused on representing Black New Yorkers. And so we often collaborate with a range of other civil rights organizations that are involved in this process. And so what we have done over the past few weeks was put together a series of trainings. Myself, Ms. Dunn, and Della Harley, who you'll hear from a little bit later, about how to participate effectively in the redistricting process. So to reiterate, I don't know how many of you were here from the week before, but if you were, it's fine, just bear with me. We just always like to give people a chance to catch up, if you will, to what we have been discussing in these presentations. So redistricting is the process of redrawing political district boundaries, and district boundaries often determine who gets elected. And the purpose of these trainings is to increase effective participation and advocacy in the redistricting process. To increase participation and advocacy in this process, we must analyze the political effect of maps according to our communities of interest, which is a very, very broad term and really is like a composite of a lot of different indices. Hence, we must create and submit maps that reflect communities of interest. And just so you know, communities of interest is exactly how it sounds. It's just that in drawing districts, we don't cross geographical boundaries because maps often need to adhere to a certain criteria. So we try to keep and make sure that these communities grow territorially or geographically. And they do so, by ethnicity. And so it's not to say that race cannot be used, but race is like the underlying thing that is used outside of all the other factors. And it's usually people who could come together across legislative concerns. So it's often ethnicity, it's often economic reasons, and some social reasons, such as just transportation issues, economic reasons such as small business assistance, and oftentimes different types of markets, if you will, fishing communities, agro communities, all these different things that people can come together and advocate for in the state legislature, in the local legislature, or in the federal legislature. So we try to do these things in a specific geographic boundary. So we create and submit maps that reflect communities of interest that can assist CLSJ. So towards the end of this process, we're hoping that you submit some maps to us after you learn to draw some of these maps. And some things may sound repetitive because they go hand in hand. This is something that, you have to, it's not a spectator sport. You have to be hands-on, and then you start to see why it becomes political and why we try to keep the political nature in terms of race out of it and move it more towards a geographic concentration. Next slide. So these trainings, the first week was about geocoding and really to discuss how the Census Bureau geocode their different geographic areas from, say, and I can show you a Census Bureau hierarchy of geographic areas a little later, from census blocks all the way to the nation states, but in between is census block groups, census tracts, voting tabulated districts, often known as VTDs, electoral districts, precincts, you name it, state legislative districts, zip codes, on and on and on, congressional districts, all the way up to counties, states, and other community boundaries. The second week, we discussed how we can analyze census and election data, which was last week, and it was a pretty interesting conversation because some things will repeat. We went through really why and how we choose individuals and how we determine the effectiveness of our participation vis-a-vis racial bloc voting or racial polarization. And we try to do this by coding each electoral districts, often known as precincts, according to their racial classification or ethnic classification. So we want to make sure or see, and I can show you some of the things that we looked at a little later again, whether or not these electoral districts, which they usually are, right, homogeneous. In other words, is a certain percent of the census tract or the electoral district or the precinct, if you will, of a monolithic nature in terms of race. Is it 85% Black? And are these individuals voting with a specific strength in terms of more than that 80% or 90% threshold is voting for a Black candidate if a Black candidate is in the race, or are they crossing racial lines? So we went through a bit of that to discuss these different things because we want to know if no matter how many districts we draw, how many different ways we draw these districts, our voting age population or our citizen voting age population is not significant enough or does not have enough strength to elect the candidates of our choice. So this week, we just expound a little bit more about these statistical boundaries, especially since the decennial census, which is more about parameters as opposed to statistics, because in terms of a decennial census, we measure the total population as opposed to taking a sample. But we're forced now to rely on statistics, if you will, because the decennial census is not yet out, but we know, given COVID, et cetera, that we can make certain predictions of what we see in our communities of people moving about the place. Next week, we'll continue along statistics for redistricting. I'll probably get ahead of myself today, but nothing wrong with going over it again. And then the last 2 weeks, we leave for mapping, where we'll have special presentations, and it will mostly try to be hands-on for you because we want community input. Next slide. So again, we went through the geocoding and how these geo IDs are assigned, and each block that you live on or that you see in New York City and the United States are coded. Every single block has a unique ID and a unique code, and we use these blocks because oftentimes the electoral districts do not align with the census districts. So we have to have these specific IDs so that we can match them and that we can overlay these different things in the different programs. When we get to mapping, you'll see, in order to make sure that the districts are aligned and that we have the necessary demographic populations in terms of citizens, in terms of age, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, to calculate how many people and making sure that there is population equality. And we use a specific GIS software. There are many out there now. It's more about public input now. So there are a lot of online factors here. And so again, this will be on display in weeks 5 and 6. We told an American Community Survey to show the power of statistics, if you will, and how we advocate or how elected officials should use statistics, or how you as a nonprofit or community advocate should recommend specific policies and programs in your community, and how you configure your own communities of interest, whether it's around affordable housing, whether it's around teenage pregnancy, whether it's around other pandemics, et cetera. So, and we know that at one point, just an example, although it's often not classified, that teenage pregnancy was sort of this epidemic / pandemic, right? And now homelessness is considered that, although it's overridden by COVID-19. And so we discussed how to access the ACS, American Community Survey data as well, which is like the most important piece of information now. Next slide. Last week, we discussed how to choose the correct geography for redistricting and drawing a map. And we know sometimes there are larger areas than others, as I just discussed, but the correct one should be according to electoral district for Board of Elections data, and in terms of us, census block or census block group. So we want to identify the correct data needed for the geography that you have chosen and grasp the use of election data in the redistricting process. And we put up a couple of maps to show how this will be displayed. And then we want to comprehend how election data interact with census data to produce these maps. So how people vote, how much people come out to vote, how many people are registered to vote, those things matter. And then we use the power, which we'll see now, well, not really see, the power of statistics to determine voter history. Next slide. So here's what we're trying to do. We just want you to get some basic statistic terminology down pat in terms of the difference between statistics and parameter with respect to population data, because as I stated before, we're relying more on the American Community Survey now to make these census predictions, utilize statistics for our communities, how comfortable we are with having this error, right? Because statistic, you're predicting some error into your analysis. How much is supposed to deviate from this average or this norm or this mean, and how we analyze community data. Next.
So we're going to take a quick poll. Okay. Can everyone see that?
I don't see the, oh yeah, now I see it.
Okay. So yeah, if you see, it's only 2 questions. So if you can go ahead and take the poll, we'll give you about, I don't know, 30 seconds. This is so easy. And this way we can gather some quick information about where everyone is within the room. All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to stop the poll. Okay, so have you ever participated in the redistricting cycle? 83% people have not. Only 17% have. Did you attend our previous workshops on redistricting? 75% attended both. Only 1 person did not attend. This is their first time here. So most people, 75% have attended both sessions. Let me see. There you go. You guys can see that, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we got a good, nice group to interact with here today. Okay, so we can continue.
So we'll just go right in. There we go.
So why redistrict? So I sort of try to give you a little bit about the language of redistricting. So it's the process of allocating seats in the legislature. So I put up 51 seats for the city council because that's the thing that's closest to us. But we know that in the congressional, only one part of it is apportioned, and that's the House of Representatives. And that's where we say all politics are local, right? So how many are there in the House of Representatives? Let's see, test your basic civic duties, basic civic knowledge. How many individuals are in the House of Representatives? You could put it in the chat.
Hey.
No. Anyone else? 435. Yes, Kevin. No, 535 is combined, Senate and House of Representatives. But in the House of Representatives, Kevin is correct. It is 435. And so because this has not changed since 1911, the process every 10 years of deciding based on population how many representatives a state will receive. So we reapportion But we'd love 5:30. We sure would, because then we could get some of our elected officials a little bit quicker and a little bit easier. Okay, right now they're representing approximately 711,000 individuals. And so that's, phenomenal. And we should note that this is only the 50 states, Puerto Rico, DC, the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, etc. Those are not included in the process or reapportioned, right? They're there as representatives, but they don't go through this process with us. So in this case, we are concerned with increasing the number of majority Black districts. So, but we start, instead of the City Council, with House of Representatives. Congress goes first, then the state legislature, although the states do draw the congressional districts, and then the City Council is third. So currently the City Council, we keep putting that up because the City Council, if they sue, they're running on old lines. And we know that the City Council overturns this year all local elections, mayoral elections, city elections. They are all running on current lines. And so in 2 years, they will probably have to run again, because that's when redistricting for City Council will appear. So this is the nature of the beast. This happens. And usually they don't do it unless someone sues. But guess what? Someone always sues and brings them into court. So gerrymandering is about, refers to the manipulation of these district lines to affect political power. And it's every attempt to draw district lines has a political impact, and we'll tell you why. And what we're trying to prevent for our community especially is malapportionment. So let's do a little exercise to see what happens to New York, or, in terms of how this is reapportioned and how we determine what happens next. So what's the population for the country? Anyone knows? Approximately, because we don't have the decennial numbers, approximately the population for the country is 328 million, right? Or billion, whatever those numbers are, right? And so hypothetically speaking, what we would do with that is we would get, we would divide that number, the total number of the US population, by, what's the number we would divide it by?
435.
You're not supposed to ask. Yes, we would divide it by 435. And then that would tell us the total number of individuals each elected official or each congressional member of the House of Representatives would have to represent. So that number comes out to approximately 754,000, well, not approximately, 754,482. I say approximate because it's based on ACS, right? It's not based on the decennial census, and we'll discuss that in a minute. So it's approximately, let's just say 755,000. That's upwards of 45,000 that each elected official, unless some law changes that will increase the House of Representatives, which will not happen, some elected official will have to do it. Now, what happens next? Then we look at New York State's population. New York State's population is approximately 19.45 million. And so we divide that number again, and we get to this decimal of approximately, we divide 19.45 million into what? By 754,482. Are you following me, or am I losing you? Everyone's following me? I take that as a yes. So that comes up to, pardon me, approximately 26. How many seats does New York State currently have? Put it in the chat. Federal seats. How many seats does New York State currently have in the House of Representatives? You can't look it up on the internet. That's cheating. Okay, 27, but you took a while, 27, yes. Kevin, you'll stop. So yes, we currently have 27, and we're expected to lose 1 based on New York State's population, and we don't know what will happen with COVID, right? We absolutely have no idea until later on in the year what's going to happen. So now New York State has to divide its congressional representation into 26 seats. We lose one. And we've been decreasing since 1990, right? From 33 to 31 to 29 to 27, and now going down to 26. How will we reapportion? How will we redraw? Who will get drawn out? And that's why it now becomes this political ball game. That's where the gerrymandering comes in place. And that's where we as communities have to try to figure out how our vote will not be diluted, because oftentimes the criteria for redistricting puts us in a situation where we do get diluted because of how we grow geographically or how we lose populations, depending on things such as gentrification and things of that nature. So we are going from 27 to 26. Now it's a scramble. Which community is going to lose a seat? Who is this going to fall on? Which burden will this community have? And you'll say, who cares? We care because we need the resources for our community, right? We need the programs. We need representation in DC. We need the principal factor, Medicaid, right? Healthcare, access to healthcare. All of these different issues, which we discussed somewhat for different communities last week. Next slide. So we have this thing, right? We have these different criteria, which I was discussing. And so that's what you see up there, right? The biggest thing is population equality, compactness, contiguity, and there are formulas for this, right? And then everything else is like according to states. So we try to preserve county lines, political subdivisions. The biggest thing for us is communities of interest, which is why we're all here, I hope. We try to preserve cores of prior districts, or again, boundaries for Flatbush, Crown Heights. We know those boundaries all too well, right? Empire Boulevard, Fulton Street, for Bed-Stuy, all these different things we try to preserve because it's not by accident that communities align along these different boundaries, right? It's not by accident that some rents go up in certain areas and not others, or some communities flock to some areas and not others, and how we have these commercial strips and business improvement districts. So, and we try to avoid peering incumbents because that's where the political stuff are. If you ever heard Congressman Jeffries discuss how he got into politics, he'll often tell you that when he was running for the state legislature, he's challenged a legendary person, Assemblyman Roger Green, a couple of times, and he woke up one morning and he was laying in one district and found himself gerrymandered outside the district. Why? Because he was a challenger to Assembly Member Roger Green. So at that time, you know, state legislatures were responsible for drawing districts. And so this is what happens, right? So we avoid peering incumbents, especially how we have them here for in our communities, 8th, 9th, whatever, congressional districts, 5th and 6th. Prohibition on favoring or disfavoring incumbents, candidate or party. So the story I just explained was an example of how that goes. And so how do you do it? You go, usually what happens, people always have a chance to challenge when maps are drawn. The legislature doesn't have to pass it the first time around. When the districting commission submits these maps to the legislature, it is a law, so they vote it up or down. And usually it's the third time that they end up doing some of these different things. So let's discuss a little bit what this population equality mean. So population equality for the federal level, House of Representatives, it has to be exactly 755,000. We can only deviate by one person. However, this is where the statistics part come in. For the state legislature and the local districts, you can deviate up to 10% from the lowest populated district to the highest populated district. So for example, if the 35th district has the smallest number at 130,000, the highest district, such as the 46th council district, having 190,000, it cannot be those two numbers from the average for which they have it, or congressional district, sorry, for the 8th and whatever, the 430 state legislature, sorry, city council, cannot deviate more than 10%. The lowest population number to the highest population number, given that middle number, the mean cannot deviate more than 10%. Think of it in like a seesaw. So one may be at a -1%, have the lower number than the average, and then the highest district may be at +9. It's really no mathematical formula. It just cannot be more than 10%. What the Redistricting Commission is trying to do is make it ±5. It never pans out to be so perfect, right? And again, it depends on your voice and the communities of interest, but also more importantly, what the numbers reveal. And that's what we're trying to predict here. So compactness is, as I discussed, it's a shape analysis, right? And usually if the districts are drawn to prevent gerrymandering, it is, or any political favoring, and really according to the principles, it's usually a nice compact district. It's usually, you know, given a particular shape. It's usually given what you could see by a naked eye test. So there are a couple of formulas that people use for a compactness. They have very strange names. Posby-Pepper compact test. And what it says in the Rioch measure test and all these other tests, they're mathematical formulas. And what they do is they try to measure the area or the circumference or inside of the shape from, or the height of the district. And a computer program does this, of course, right? From the top to the bottom, or from the beginning of the district to the end, to see it, how compact it is. The closer the number is, it ranges from 0 to 1. The closer the number is to 1 on your computer, the more compact it is, and vice versa. So it's a very simple formula. It's usually just the area times 16 over the perimeter, right? So it tells you the shape. And usually when you see something close to the naked eye, such as a square, chances are it is compact. So think of like a square, right? I always use a puzzle as an analysis, but a nice square, think of like a 3x3 square or 6x6 square, right? Nice shape, very compact, height, etc., from beginning to end, width, everything is in tune, and you just count around the perimeter. Versus something like a Z-shaped, right? Something in a Z-shaped format is bound to be way less than 1, probably like 0.3 or 0.4, and you're counting for days, and then you really have to justify why it has this kind of shape, right? Any court looking at that from the naked eye would probably say, what's going on here? We suspect, because you're overreaching now, that there's some gerrymandering going on, right? Because the naked eye reveals this, the shape reveals this, and so you have to justify that, you know, you're preserving communities of interest, okay? And contiguity, I expressed over and over, you know, each district must be together. We can't have, let's think of a block, isolated from another block in the district. And so it must be connected by some geographical entity, such as a bridge, et cetera. Sometimes we see, if you look over in Bushwick, Williamsburg, et cetera, Nydia Velasquez, Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez, her district goes over to the Lower East Side, right? What is it preserved by? Right? A bridge. So you see those different things happening. Any question on compactness and contiguity? Okay, next slide. And so there is this timeline that we often try to work on, but again, even though the data are not out yet, it's still a timeline because communities have begun drafting reports, have begun drawing maps, people are organizing all across the country. Why? Because even when one election ends, right, we know that these elected officials, 435 members, often have elections every 2 years, okay? So how their districts are drawn depends on their elections and re-elections. Sometimes we want the competitiveness of it, but we know that they want the safeness of it. So a timeline is crucial, especially if we have upcoming elections, and each state is different, but we know that the general election stays the same. But in New York, we rely on primary elections. Okay, so the redistricting data we know that it's supposed to be the decennial census. We know that we have to build a database, and it's according to voting districts, it's according to blocks, it's according to the voting history, it's according to the voter turnout, it's according to the registration data. And so we start to build this thing, and we start to learn, as I just outlined before, the redistricting language. Next. Next slide. So I pretty much explained why statistics are important, but let's go a little bit deeper. So it's important because we must be able to predict how much our population is growing. And we want to predict this because state legislative and local districts are drawn based upon population deviations, as I explained. So we often have to figure out, how much we think this district could encompass, right? How much a district should be packed with a specific set of a population, how much is a district cracked, and we try to prevent cracking because these are, although some people say they're not relevant anymore, voting rights issues that often come about or used to come about. And then it's about community empowerment. And so giving you this voice to analyze this and to know the numbers and then to reapportion accordingly to know that this is what's happening and this is how much your population in your district should accept or accommodate is what you want to take away from this. And of course, we want to elect candidates of our choice. So we want to obtain our fair share of funding for schools and other community-based organizations and create and grow organizations and programs that support our community's interests. Next slide. Also, states, commissions, and map drawers do not use decennial census data exclusively. So we should know that. Again, they use the ACS. They build other databases. Remember, they're listening to input from you. So how will you tell your story for your community? You need this data, right? Some people go in and say, no, we care about water. Especially individuals like in the Sheepshead Bay area or Coney Island area or Sheepshead Bay, Coney Island, Manhattan Beach, those areas. They may say, we care more about the water. Other areas may say, we care more about what happens when environmental disasters happen. Other areas may say, we care more about schools or whatever. But you really need to use the power of statistics to tell the story of what's happening in your community. Otherwise, sometimes it can, they take everything into consideration and everything is logged, but you want it to be meaningful when you go in there to perform, and they will be holding community testimonies. And of course, many people don't use Board of Elections data, but they do. And so it is incumbent upon us to look at voting data. So which voting data would you want to use? I would say I would look at, right, the last 8 years, right? I would look at maybe from 2013, I would look at some statewide data. I would look at the lieutenant governor's race, right? We had a Black candidate running, we had a white female running. And so we want to see, how these votes are divided by our precincts and by our voting history, and whether or not we need to do some community organizing in terms of voter registration on our own. Next slide. So here we have it. We also may want to look at were there minority candidates, as I just stated. We want to look at referenda. So total number of people who turned out to vote, and we make these predictions. if these numbers of individuals, I don't know how many you work on political campaigns or watch voting elections, et cetera, you know, people are making predictions right now about how many people will turn out to vote in the mayoral elections, especially given that there is an Asian contender, there are a lot of female contenders, there are a lot of Latino, Black, et cetera, you know, all across the board. How will voter turnout fare? Is this a wild card election? But you want to make this prediction. Back in 2013, I think the turnout was no more than about 30% in some districts. Will it hit 50%? We just don't know, but there are 30 candidates. So we want to sort of make a good prediction. We want to look at now that there is things that we have now we didn't have before. We now have ranked choice voting. Will that drive turnout, or will people go in and do the same thing? We now have, besides, we had in the past referenda to put ranked choice voting in there. I'm not sure how many people understand it, right? We have early voting now, and a good majority of our population will still use absentee ballot, which everyone will be using. So we ought to take a look at some of these different things when we're calculating voting. And of course, we want to look at the minority candidates. And as I mentioned before, Asian candidate, Black candidates, et cetera. These are issues that we need to consider. Next slide. So additional data, I can't stress enough, the voting statistics, I just gave you a couple, right? How are we gonna predict the next set, right? So local elections do not get as much earned media as federal elections, as we saw the last time around. And most people still do not know in New York State that the primary elections, that they should choose a party, because the primary elections are pretty much perfunctory, right, of what happens in the general election, or else, unless you have a real competitive district and someone runs on something like a working families party line or something to that effect. But you ought to, like we did the last time, take a look at the precinct maps and see how these voting districts are faring. So you need to look. Does anyone know the largest political party in New York State, if it was a party, what it would be? Anyone putting it in the chat? What would be the largest political party if it were a political party when people register to vote? It would be blank, because most people do not choose a party. It will be the blank party. And so this is how we lose out on our voting strength as well. This is why sometimes turnout is so low in the primary, because most people consider themselves either independents, or a very few go along different extreme party lines, like a conservative party or independence party, et cetera, working families party. And now they have more, but what you have is most people saying, we want to be independent, we want to be moderates, we don't want to choose, and we only come out in in November. Next slide.
Okay. I guess we just want to take a break and kind of do a check-in. Does anyone have questions about what has been discussed so far?
Yes, I have a question. I had got disconnected for a minute, and you were mentioning about how we will lose some seats, and I didn't quite understand why is it that we're going to lose seats potentially this year. I didn't really quite understand why were seats going to be lost.
Sure. So we're only allotted 435 seats, and it depends on the population, how the rate of growth for your state's population. And so because New York State only increased by 0.3%, supposedly give or take 10% in terms of this deviation or statistic, because we're going on ACS data, we are predicting that we are going to lose at least one seat in the congressional election, in the House of Representatives, because it goes by the population. Lately, we have been losing seats. If I can share my screen a little bit, could I share my screen? If you just give me host privilege, let me share my screen.
Okay, Delamy, go ahead.
Okay, let me see what I can pull up. Sometimes I have these things.
So I guess while we're waiting for Dr. Blair to pull that up, does anyone have any other questions or need clarity on a couple of things that was discussed? You could put it in the chat.
So what you see is in the 2010 census, it's always between these 5 states, right? It's always between California, Texas, California again, right? At one time, it was always New York. But as I said, since 1990, we've been losing population.
Dr. Blair, we can't see anything.
You can't, oh. Okay. Let me go to 1 second, sorry. Why is it not sharing for what I am trying to share for? Oh, there it is, okay. So it's always these states, right? It's always California. So each state, it starts off like this, okay? We get the decennial census count, which we haven't gotten yet. But we're predicting that the United States is at 328.2 million or billion. I always get it mixed up, right? Billion. So then we divide that number by 435. We get 755,000 people. Then we divide that number by New York State numbers, which New York State is approximately 19.5. And then what happens is each state gets 1 seat, 435, to make sure that everyone is represented in the House of Representatives. So every state gets 1 seat. So like a Rhode Island would only get 1 seat, right? And then after that, it's 385 left, and it goes by the rate of growth of each state. So California, Texas, New York, Florida, they're always in the competition. And so far, New York has been losing. So because our rate of growth is only at 0.3, last time we lost 2, this time we're supposedly gonna lose 1. So it goes by the population counts. And if we're not growing, and who knows what's gonna happen as a result of this last go round. Some people call 2, but we've been hearing 1. And the numbers revealed 1. If you go 19.45 million and then divide it by 755,000, you would see that it comes out to about close to 26. And so now we have to subtract 21 from this 27 round that we're at.
Okay, thank you for explaining.
Yep.
It's just sometimes it's just hard to like from when you're living in the city, it's hard to see that because in my neighborhood, people just won't stop coming. So sometimes it's just hard to see like why we
No, that's a good point, and I want to talk about that. I'm glad you brought that up because this is why it's important, because there are a lot, and this is why sometimes people suggest an estimate, because we know that populations are hard to count. And we know that individuals do not fill out the census. Approximately 60 to 70% of the country probably fills out the census. But maybe in our communities, it's really at that number. But in other communities, we know that some people actually get double counted. And people do it for a variety of reasons, right? Citizenship, the fair, et cetera, which the Census Bureau cannot go after individuals. What they can do is say in this particular area of space that we have this amount of foreign-born individuals, and these individuals, based on our administrative records, may be undocumented. But they cannot target a specific individual, right? They can group data. But that's what you have, right? You have, and so even though we're saying that one elected official is supposed to represent 755,000 people, in this downstate area, they're probably representing 800 to 900,000 people each, right? Because of that. And you just point that out It was well stated, right? People keep coming, but they don't get counted, right? And then some people are double counted because they have 2 homes, one in Florida, one in New York, right? One in Long Island, one in upstate, and on and on and on. Okay, so let me stop. You're welcome. Stop my share.
Dr. Blair, we got a question
Sure.
from someone in the audience. He asked, I don't want to mispronounce your name, so but his question is, instead of ACS data, hypothetically, would collecting geographic information from tax filing be a more accurate count?
So they use all of those things. That's what I was referring to by administrative data, right? That's how they could determine undocumented immigrants, because some people don't have a social security number, they have a tax ID, and on, right? So we use all of those data, right? We use passports issuance, we use visas, we use anything from Adela, please jump in. Department of Homeland Security. We use locally. We use Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. We use birth and death records to balance out the counts. And that's how we determine, because we know that undocumented immigrants also use emergency rooms. That's what they use, or they use the expansion of the healthcare programs for our HHC, right? Our Health and Hospitals Corporation. So they document that as well. And that's how you determine whether or not some neighborhoods were undercounted or overcounted. So we have all these other remedies, if you will, to check and balance what the census actually does. And they do use it. So they use the tax records. They use property taxes. They use schools. Oh, that's where you find everyone, right? In the schools. So they use all of the attendance, etc. So thank you.
So we want to keep sharing. We want to go back to the presentation, or do people have more questions?
I think that someone had, okay.
Let's see. I think I saw another question in the chat. Or maybe not. Okay. Okay, so any other questions?
No, I don't see. Oh, I see one more in the chat. I don't know. Are the numbers of driver's license used for anything? Well, that's similar to passports. I think Ms. Junie, did I pronounce that right? Granville? Are the number of driver's license used for anything? Yes, that's part of administrative data too, but that determines, that's similar to whether or not you're a citizen of the state, because you know you're a citizen of the country and the state, or you're a citizen of the state, but may not be a citizen of the country. So that's how they determine certain things as well. Another option that's used is the ID NYC. And they use Board of Elections data as well, right? And sometimes they say, oh, we have citizens, we have people who are not citizens who are registering to vote, and those are not documented, hence their proposal to give us, to use or to require IDs when voting in some states, but some states have pushed back against that, including New York. Okay, I think there was there another, if you go back one slide. Okay, there wasn't okay, I thought there was a question. Okay, so samples. So just try to give you basic statistics information so that you understand what the ACS is doing and how citizen voting age and all these different things, and how you could just make some predictions, or even just do it according to your block and try to do your area, right? So we clearly cannot account for every single individual in a particular community. We just don't have the time or the resources available to interview every single individual unless it's the Census Bureau, right? And so even them on an annual basis do not interview every single household, right? They just don't have the resources. That's why it happens every 10 years, but a lot happens every 10 years, okay? So the population have changed drastically, and we can't use old data to develop new programs. So we create a sample. And ACS, the American Community Survey, does a sample. Their sample consists of approximately 3.5 million individuals that they average out about, they interview about 200, 300,000 monthly, but it comes up to 3.5 million for the year. And they usually get a response rate of 86%. So they take a sample, and the sample is determined by how much power you want to give to your data set, right? How much confidence do you want to make that you can generalize to the whole population? And you want to do this properly because there are different ways to take samples. You want to make sure that you take the sample randomly, so you could do it like a lottery, right? That's how they have it. So you're taking a subset of units selected from a larger set, which is the population. But if I take a sample of the United States or of New York State, I need to be able to say that this sample is, I am very confident, and they do it at 90%, 95%, or 99%. But they don't risk going to 99% because that's a lot of money. That's like doing the whole decennial census and you only have a 1% error. So they try to say that 90% of this generalization is accurate. And so you will often see this plus or minus 5% or whatever it is for the ACS, or the American Community Survey for how off their exact numbers are, how much error they risk. Okay, so when they say that the Black community have decreased by this amount, or this is the number of your community for this particular year, 2018, or this 5-year estimate, all the way down to the block level, they want to predict that with 90% because that's they use. So they risk 10% error. And so these are units studied and provided data for use in estimating the characteristics of the larger data set. So this is what's used to predict that this is the current population for the United States, right? This 328 billion, right? And sampling is most widely used for surveys, as we just said, the American Community Survey. Now, the American Community Survey is very long because it's very comprehensive, and it was originally the census long form, and it started in 2005, and 2010 was the first time a 5-year estimate was produced, and each year since then, they've produced the 5-year estimate, the last one being in 2019. And it usually covers those 5 years, 2010, 2011, 2012, or 2013, 14, that 5-year period. And so you would keep using that and see the rate of change for each year for the different population, and then predict what the 2020 census would be. So if your rate is going down, then you would probably assume that the Black population in this area is going to continue to decrease. And you normally see it in a qualitative format. So it's most widely used for surveys. And so the population, as we said, is a total set of units in which the investigator is interested in. And so we're interested in, let's just say, our block. So we take a sample of our block. Usually it pans out to about 1% of the population or 10% of the population, depending on how large the community is. But we try to do it in terms of how much error we're willing to risk. Okay, so if we're willing to risk 10% error, we use a smaller sample size, but we don't want to use too small of a sample because then we won't be able to say that this is what our block really looks like. We won't be able to generalize, and we'll make a lot of errors. And these errors, if we make too many of it, turns into biases, right? Like, for example, how many Black males are graduating from high school, right? How many Black females are graduating from vocational schools, all these different things, right? So we wanna make sure that we're not drawing these biases or creating these fallacies or these inferences that will create a biased public policy outcome. And this is what the power of statistic really tries to help you navigate, okay? So this is about getting this right information, getting the right target, and doing the right type of analysis to do so. So what's the sample that you're going to take, and could we necessarily rely on the ACS? And we can, right? It's shown to be pretty conservative in terms of how we do it. So we want to pretty much see how much they drop out. And like I said, we have an 86% response rate for it. I don't know if any of you have ever been tapped to complete the survey, but it's a very long form and it determines your citizenship, your economic power, your educational level, all of the different things that the Census Bureau just leaves up to it to really go down into a detailed estimate. Next slide. And so sometimes what we have, we need a sample and frame. And so we need to make sure that how random things are drawn, that the total number of individuals of the substrata of the population are accurately measured. So for example, if we are looking at a population or looking at the US, et cetera, we need to make sure that we take a specific percent of African Americans, we take the specific set of, and then randomly draw from them. So we would take 12 to 13% of African Americans, a subset of them. Same thing with Latino individuals, 12 to 13%, maybe 6% for Asians, and on, because we need to make sure that we have a good subsample of each group to draw an accurate picture of the population. Next slide. And so this just tells you the different types of language that's used. The parameter, meaning the average, we average, mean, median, mode. If it's a whole population, they're called parameters. If it's a sample, we use statistic. And so we just differentiate between the two. Next slide. And so our biggest concern is how much error we have. And as I stated, and why is this important? It's really important because we don't want to apportion and draw districts based on too much of an error. If our population, if our sampling or whatever we're predicting this on is off by more than 10%, then chances are our vote will be diluted, right? We will not have one person, one vote. And we brought this up before in somebody, not at the moment, but we will be putting together a package for people. I don't understand, sorry.
That's for Sherry. She was asking about if the workshops will be available before the map drawing.
Oh, okay.
So I was just letting her know that they're not available right now, but they will be.
Okay. So sampling error, the expected error, estimating a parameter, like I said, for drawing these maps, we tried to do only a 10% deviation. And so the Census Bureau always only used 10% deviation. And so we want to make sure that our error is not larger than that. And then we do a plus or minus 5% there. And the same thing with the standard error, how much we deviate from the theoretical sampling distribution. Next slide. So we try to distinguish between error and bias, which I just explained, and not all error is bias, but we want to make sure that it doesn't rise to a level of bias. And I just explained how we can do it. We can do things differently. We could take a sample geographically, maybe across different boroughs. We could take a sample by race or ethnicity. We could take samples by age groups. And you can do this, obviously, to predict voting history. You can do this to predict how much people will turn out to vote in the future and the age groups that they would turn out. And you could do this to predict voting outcome, right? Election outcomes. And so that's usually what is used when we talk about, you know, homogeneous and racial block voting and precinct analysis. Next slide.
I
Oh,
think that's it. Yeah,
okay.
That's it. And
I'll take questions now, and I can pull up my other screen as well. Don't share it yet. Let me
okay.
go into questions.
So what you guys are looking at right now, we've been providing this community survey at each of the training sessions. And what it does is it helps you identify the key areas within your community that are important to the community. For instance, markets or churches or community centers. But also it helps us determine what those areas are and what's of value, and so that you keep those areas or that you receive more of those areas in your community. And so, so this survey is something that we're collecting. So it's for CLSJ, and so we'll use this, we'll incorporate this for the unity maps. So I know that the people that have been with us the last 2 weeks, they have probably already filled it out. So anyone new, I think it was only one new person. If you could fill this out, it's very easy. If you hold your phone up to the QR code in your photo, if you go to your photo, and it'll automatically take you directly to the survey. Or I could post the link in the chat for you, and I could do that right now as well. But I can, I'll do that. It'll be in the chat in a second. But did you want?
Go ahead, sorry, Kim.
No, it's okay. That's really all I wanted to say. Did you want to share your screen?
Yeah, I want to know, Della, do you want to add anything about what you've seen in your voting history?
No, I think you've said all
Okay.
at this point.
So what we've been discussing a lot is theoretical redistricting. We can go a little bit into practical redistricting. And what we know that these are the players, right? And they're all 3 levels. Government, 3 levels, the public, individuals, public interest organizations, and private entities. And here's a summary of what's happening, right? The president, the governor, and we start to see certain things. What people don't normally like to get into is the judicial process for it. And that's why statistics is so important, particularly with respect to the compactness, the contiguity, and the communities of interest. And that's where we start to see, we usually see a 3-judge panel for these particular categories. And so the public, which it will be us, right? You giving your input. Since you now have access to these GIS tools to draw their proposed districts via public access websites, public interest groups can now afford the resources to do some serious redistricting. So, Kiana, I'm not sure if you wanted to, at this point, pull up probably your map that you can show. And so there are some mapping software that you will see going forward. In 2010, we've sort of tried to introduce more. Maptitude came on the scene and more people were accessing it, but they did not have the public transparency that they needed in terms of producing this, right? So now we have people having a lot of free software, and public interest groups and nonprofit and philanthropic organizations, like New York Communities for Change and things of that nature, really investing in how do we make this open to the public and how we make this less of a messy process when it comes to this redistricting, because it's not just happening in the US, right? Census happens all over the world. Most countries do a census count. And let's not go, okay, so here is the standard hierarchy of the census geographic entities that we've been discussing. And so we are going to, and most prior to, so the Census Bureau usually does it by voting districts, right? Minor subdivisions, county subdivisions, census tracts, et cetera. We normally see what they call voting districts is how they usually overlay it with. Now, what these public maps are doing, they're going all the way down to the census block levels and for the Board of Elections data for the electoral districts that you match with the census block data. So that's a more precise way, which is why I asked, I think I asked this, oh, maybe I didn't, but do you know the racial and ethnic makeup of your block? And so I'll put that out there now. Anyone?
Let's see.
And this is what happens with when there are a lot of people moving in and out of your block, because sometimes you do know, sometimes you don't know. It depends on whether or not you have a strong block association or whether or not your block is really organized. Some people don't even know who lives next door to them, right? And so if you did have know the racial and ethnic makeup of your block, which the Census Bureau would provide, and again, gentrification had sort of threw off these numbers, do you have an idea of how people on your block vote? Because that's what you will need to know to sort of have this voting history and predict. If not, the Board of Elections only give it to you by electoral district. And then so your communities of interest tasks start to become a little bit harder. So these are some of the practical ways. We've been discussing theoretical ways, but we need to look at practical ways of how some of these things happen. And do you pay attention to other ballot initiatives? Some people do not know that there are ballot initiatives, and they just go in the queue and the voting booth and check off yes for the ballot initiatives. And we want to know sometimes, is that driving up turnout or driving down turnout? Will ranked choice voting drive up turnout or drive down turnout? So it's good to know the makeup of your block if you're really considering drawing a map. So start there. It's good to know the demographics of your block. Again, start there and just start in these particular areas because it's easier to match your block with a census block geography. As you can see, that's the lowest geographic group, and they have specific geo IDs that you can match it and get the age. What they will give is the age, the race, the ethnicity, the gender, and then you would overlay it with whether or not individuals are citizens, and then you would get Board of Elections data for your area to see how many individuals are actually registered to vote. And it's the same thing that I just discussed, right? And so blocks are like a few hundred people, right? And practical people, what we consider or organizations consider when they're drawing this, or legislatures or redistricting commissions, they consider one, whether or not incumbents are being paired, and that's when it becomes political. It already becomes political if you increase or decrease a seat, because then it determines who will lose, who will be challenging, if then the seat is increasing, how many people will run for that seat, how the district will be drawn so that which communities of interest become represented. And again, this all depends on census numbers, but because we don't have the census numbers, we have to make a prediction. And the best way to use it is the ACS, and just keep in mind that there's a 10% error term built into the ACS data. So you have to use the power of statistics to overcome that. And so you want to count these are some of the controversial issues, which a friend discussed earlier. It looks like people are just moving in, but they're not counted. So how do we capture that count? And so public testimony such as yours will be powerful, because maybe they're not counted, maybe the census, this is what the census revealed, but this is what you witnessed. And so will they take that into consideration when they're counting, when they're drawing, sorry. And what's the best way to capture that? And it's really a communities of interest issues. So I just want to discuss those things, because what happens now is whether or not people are only going, and what we're seeing now is people are mostly, some people are saying multiracial, but what I find in New York State, you're either Black, very few people in certain districts say that they're Black and Latino. Most people will say that they're Latino, and or they'll identify with either race or their other ethnicity, Asian, etc. They won't necessarily just say that they're multiracial groups, at least not in New York. What's happening across the country is a little bit different, but we often have to worry about this undercount and other disenfranchisement issues that the voting rights share. So I'll stop there and take any questions from there.
And just while everyone is thinking about questions or comments, I just want to mention that for our next session, it will take place not this coming week, but the following week, because the college will be on for spring break next week. So we'll reconvene Wednesday, April 7th. And so if you haven't already, you can go ahead and register for that session at the CLSJ.org on the website. Just wanted to mention that. I can show a preliminary map that we have of all the Black communities within New York City.
And where do you see yourselves on this map? And Della, if you could also discuss some of the immigrant populations and where you think that they fall.
So this here, and this might, I know one of the brothers from last week asked a question about mapping. So here is a, when last or a couple weeks ago, we talked about geocoding and geo IDs. So what you're looking at is, it might be hard to see on this on this screen, but just bear with me. So what you're looking at are the census tracts. So remember, there was different granular data that we could extract from the ACS census data. So this is looking at the census tracts, and it's where all people, Black people, are within New York City. And so the darker the color is where is more concentrated areas. And can everyone see this? I know it might be hard to see.
Could you enlarge in it? Yeah.
Okay.
Bigger.
Yeah, my screen is small. I can't zoom in just because of it's so pixelated, but I just wanted to give you a representation of sort of where the Black communities are. So as we dig more into the data, we'll be able to pull out the communities of interest. And so, it's important that if you can provide that information, great, but, we'll definitely extract it from the census data that we have. But just to kind of give you a visual on what or where the people are. I mean, you kind of already know, but just to kind of see it in terms of New York City. So here is the non-Hispanic. We're all non-Hispanic, and this is from 2010 ACS data. So I hope, let me see if, we do have a question in the chat. Where can we find, wait.
The first one.
From okay, so if they vote, if your block has 2 pre-war buildings across the street and the addresses are both buildings are on a block south, how does this affect the block that is one-sided? I hope I said that right.
I don't understand. If the person could explain a little bit
Yeah,
more.
can you just reiterate their question? And then I'll just go to the next one. Where can we find the best software for mapping for map drawing? So great question. So when we get to our map drawing session, we're going to use District R, and it's District R. And so it's a web-based application that is very user-friendly, and it's free, and it's, you can just easily log in. I mean, you don't need a login to access it. So, and it's called District R. So that's what we'll be demoing for you in a couple weeks. So let me just put that in the chat, just in case people want to do their research. That's the mapping software.